How does an empire build support for its resource exploitation abroad? Well, immediately following the 9/11 attacks, Americans were riddled with panic and anxiety. And talking heads and even our elected leaders stoked our fears, warning there would be more attacks to come unless we stopped the terrorists in their tracks. But who exactly flew the planes into the Twin Towers? Well, quickly, the Bush administration and other pro-war neocons in Washington tossed out some pretty interesting answers. Osama bin Laden, Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, or maybe even Muslims. With this, Bush launched the invasion of Afghanistan and announced the official war on terror, which continues today with no end in sight and no real victories to speak of. But then in 2003, the target shifted. Saddam Hussein, the leader of Iraq, who America had once cherished, even installed and armed, now had weapons of mass destruction. Our intelligence was definite, they said, and with that, the U.S. invaded Iraq. Those WMDs were never found, of course, because they never existed. And not only was the intel faulty, it turned out to be a red herring, obscuring a war for oil and resources. A country was invaded, its people killed, injured, and displaced, so the U.S. could install someone more friendly to our interests. Meanwhile, the upheaval in these and countries hit by the war on terror created a power vacuum that's being exploited today by Daesh or ISIS. None of what unfolded was unforeseeable. So who was on the sidelines in Washington cheerleading for this war? And despite being pounded daily by the mainstream media and our politicians that this war is against terrorism or ISIS, like any war, what appears on the surface as a humanitarian effort is usually a smokescreen for something else. Now, here to answer these and other questions is Robbie Martin, the filmmaker behind A Very Heavy Agenda. His documentary film series examines how neoconservatives seized on 9/11 as a catalyst for establishing a new world order. With 9/11 fading from our memory, Martin warns the U.S. created a new enemy, so it chose an old one. And no, it wasn't Muslims. It's Russia. Take a look.
What most people, would know as PNAC is the Project for the New American Century. The founders of that organization, Bill Kristol and Robert Kagan, I think have flown under most people's radars. Some people might have seen Bill Kristol over the years, like as a pundit on Fox News, and now he's a pundit on CNN and ABC. But I believe these people had more influence on the Bush administration and their neoconservative policies, but I think they also had an incredible amount of influence on sort of the DC media class as well, and that was also a really important component. There are others, that flew under the radar for the most part, like Richard Pearl. Paul Wolfowitz had an important position inside the White House, so he was probably the main, I would say the main influential neocon who actually made it inside the White House. But now I feel like there's a little bit more of a public awareness of these people. Most recently, the co-founder of the Project for the New American Century endorsed Hillary Clinton out of fear of a Trump presidency. So he's actually in the news again. So as much as these people try to stay under the radar, they still play very important roles in sort of where the neoconservative agenda is headed in D.C.
Right, and I'm really glad you talked about that. Tell us more about A Very Heavy Agenda and what each part exposes and why you focus so much on neoconservatives.
So A Very Heavy Agenda is broken into 3 parts. And part 1 is pretty much all about what the neoconservatives did during the Bush administration. And I start out part 1 showing how they were the primary force in trying to draw a connection between Saddam Hussein and 9/11. And when that fell apart, they tried to connect Saddam Hussein in the 2001 anthrax letter attacks, which of course there was never any evidence of. But they were able to plant the seeds of that and hint at it enough where I believe that it helped push sort of that panic and hysteria over the edge so that Americans would let their guard down about going into another war. Part 2 of the film is called How We Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the New Neocons. And I think most people who, maybe are already familiar with the neocons and already know the stuff I cover in part 1 would find part 2 most interesting because it sort of follows the neoconservative trajectory during the Obama administration. And I lay out a lot of evidence that the neoconservatives in D.C. were very interested in reigniting essentially a new Cold War with Russia. And Robert Kagan's wife, Victoria Nuland, was actually appointed into the U.S. State Department under Obama to oversee policy in the Eastern Bloc. And this all happened like right as sort of the Ukraine situation was unfolding. So it was very convenient timing. And Robert Kagan also was appointed inside the U.S. State Department by Hillary Clinton when she was Secretary of State. And I believe he's actually still there. Part 3 of the film sort of focuses on the rest of the Kagan family because not just Robert Kagan and his wife Victoria Nuland, but his brother Fred Kagan, Fred Kagan's wife Kim Kagan, and his father Donald Kagan have also played very significant roles in sort of shaping this neoconservative agenda on all different fronts. So Donald Kagan's role for a while has sort of been to rewrite history to make it seem like all these past U.S. presidents have essentially been neoconservative. Kim and Fred Kagan's approach is very analytical, sort of strategic war think tank stuff. So they put out papers pretty much monthly about what we should do in Syria, what we should do with ISIS, and things like that. And most recently, they put out a paper called Defeating ISIS, which recommends inserting 30,000 ground troops into Iraq and Syria to essentially start the war over again in Iraq, but then also bring it over to Syria. And then coincidentally, after the neocons got super freaked out about Trump, Marco Rubio is starting to put out his 7-point plan for defeating ISIS. And if you look at this document, it is virtually identical to his 7-point plan. I mean, I would have no doubt that he is being advised by Kim and Fred Kagan at this point.
Right. I mean, characters in your documentary describe the Cold War as a bipolar era. I mean, what exactly does that mean? And did that make it easier to see who was greasing the wheels of war and propaganda?
I definitely think it did. They have a vision that sort of spans over multiple decades. So when people like Robert Kagan and Bill Kristol would talk about the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 90s, all they would talk about was how this created instability in the world. You know, while most people were excited, these people were panicking, and they realized that sort of the military-industrial complex, as we understand it, wouldn't be able to have that excuse over and over again of communism and the Soviet Union as sort of the evil empire. So when they refer to it as the bipolar world, they mean that it was sort of like another superpower existed that could keep the world sort of in this yin and yang balance. It's hard to make sense of, you know, because it almost sounds insane that they would look at the world that way, but they actually do believe that the void created by the collapse of the Soviet Union has thrown the world into chaos. And I think that in part explains their sort of rush and panic and their acceleration of things like the war on terror after 9/11, because it's just a continuation of this instability that they see. And then they need to jump into, you know, that void and act.
Well, I mean, what do you think? Are we seeing a new Cold War or a World War III landscape emerge?
I absolutely think we are. And that's the most unfortunate part of all of this is the war on terror is not, you know, it never ended. So now we have the addition of essentially a new Cold War. And the mentality that came out of the old Cold War was a dumbed down, jingoistic, nationalistic, and fearful mentality. And all those things that I just said also describe the war on terror. So I think it's a really awful development because, you know, just as more Americans seem to be waking up to the power structure, the military industrial complex, alternative media outlets and you know, places, with good information like MintPress News, while that's happening and those positive developments there, I think you know, in the past might have sounded hyperbolic to suggest a World War III scenario, but I think we're going to start seeing more rhetoric, especially from the neocons and the power structure, talking about the Soviet nuclear threat. You know, without calling it the Soviet nuclear threat, they'll call it Putin's nuclear threat.
Well, thank you so much, Robbie, for joining us today, filmmaker and director of a very heavy agenda. Hopefully we'll continue this conversation soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mnar.